Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Subrata Mitra. I'm the director of the Institute of South Asian Studies. On behalf of my colleagues, I'm very, very pleased to welcome you all, particularly to our speaker, Mr. Jaishankar, and colleagues from and distinguished guests from the Nigerian Embassy. The meeting would be chaired by my colleague, Dr. Sinderpal Singh. He will introduce the theme and the speaker. My job is to give you a little bit of context as to why we are doing this and what we might expect out of it. Now, ISAS is, well, I've counted it actually. We are 5 things stuck into one another. We are a research institute, meaning we produce new knowledge and put it on the net for everyone to see. We are a think tank. We work closely with the ministries of Foreign Affairs and Trade and Industry. We are a platform to test new talent, like you are going to see some today. And we are also a great publisher of policy papers, 350 in all per year. And if these 4 jobs are not enough, we are also a training ground for new talent from Singapore, the creme de la creme for the next generation. I say this because any one of them would have been an uphill task. We have to do all 5. What we try to do, because we are a small institute after all, 35 people in all, researchers and administrators taken together, so we try to do a little bit of the Japanese house structure, where the same room can function as living room, dining room, and so on. You just shift the furniture around. So what we are doing today is a bit like a proper senior seminar in a university setup. Chatham House rules. Whatever is said here will not be repeated outside and attributed to the person who said it. So that's the kind of atmosphere I like to produce in our seminars. And my hope is you will enjoy the conversation and that you will stay connected to us. If we don't have your visiting card, please give us one, so we'll add you to our distribution list. Now, enjoy the conversation. I'll hand it over to Dr. Sinderpal Singh. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mitra. First, I want to welcome all of you. Thank you for coming. People from MFA, from Nigerian Embassy. Let me just quickly start with introducing our guest. Mr. Dhruva Jaishankar now is a transatlantic fellow with the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund in Washington. You got his CV down there. Interestingly, he's now at the moment a visiting fellow in Singapore at the RSIS in NTU, and he will be joining Brookings India in April after the stint at RSIS. Mr. Jaishankar today is going to speak to us on a very interesting topic, India-Japan security relations in the Indo-Pacific. There's been a lot of commentary recently about maritime politics in the Indian Ocean, the Indo-Pacific, and this term, the Indo-Pacific, of course, we all know is a relatively recent moniker. And some people like it, some people don't like it. So it's interesting that Mr. Jaishankar has used the term Indo-Pacific. So I'm sure you all didn't come here to listen to me. So I pass the floor over to Mr. Jaishankar. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sinderpal Singh. Thank you to Dr. Subrata Mitra for having me here. It's my first visit to ISAS in Singapore, and it has been an institution that I've long admired from afar, and read a lot of many of the publications that are put out on the website and the like. I am also actually quite grateful for this opportunity. It's actually the first time I'll be presenting this research on India-Japan relations, and I actually expect to be presenting it again just in a couple of days, and in 2 days at RSIS, and in fact in 2 weeks at the Brookings Institution in Washington again. So I very much appreciate the opportunity for some candid feedback at this stage, as I continue to work on this issue a little bit. The reason for this topic, and actually we can get into the, I hope we can have a more robust discussion on the term Indo-Pacific and its implications and its evolution in the Q&A, but and why I picked that term for the title very deliberately. The reason why this topic is important is it's actually India-Japan ties are a fast evolving, but perhaps little appreciated relationship. It's grown quickly in its scope, its ambition, and its importance. This has been the primary subject of my ongoing research fellowship at RSIS. What I'll be talking about today is largely informed by conversations and interviews that I conducted in December and January in both New Delhi and in Tokyo. What I'll try to do in the next 15, 20 minutes or so is 5 things. The first is describe the central issue driving India and Japan together, which is the nature and implications of China's rise, and specifically certain actions by China that are seen as compromising Japanese and Indian security. 2, I'll try and describe briefly how each country, India and Japan, is responding to China, and where the other country fits into that strategy. 3, I'll give a brief overview of what I would describe as the 3 stages of India-Japan security cooperation. We're currently in the 3rd stage. 4th, I'll mention a few reasons for caution about raising expectations too far about potential India-Japan cooperation. And finally, I'll try and suggest 2 broad areas of possible future collaboration. This is an initial study. I really look forward to your comments and feedback, and I do hope to incorporate some of these discussions into my final publications. So first of all, I'll be very sort of frank here. The primary driver of India-Japan security ties is the shared and growing concern about the implications of China's rise. Let's begin first with Japan. People often forget that it was Japan that greatly facilitated China's rise in the 1980s. And it was Tokyo that defended Beijing from international sanctions after the Tiananmen Square crackdown in 1989. But this warmth in Japan-China relations began to change starting in the early 1990s. In 1992, China promulgated a law that more assertively extended its claims to the disputed Senkaku Islands, what the Chinese call the Diaoyu Islands, in the East China Sea. But it really, relations began to deteriorate in the mid-2000s when there were widespread anti-Japanese protests in China after the publication of a textbook and the textbook's supposed depictions of Japan's wartime actions in its occupation of China. Japan also in the mid-2000s became the benchmark against which China measured its progress. In 2007, a year before it hosted the Olympics, China unveiled high-speed rail. It's not coincidence that the same year that Japan hosted the Olympics in 1964, it unveiled its Shinkansen high-speed rail. Of course, in 2008, Japan hosted the Olympics, much like China hosted the Olympics, much as Japan had in 1964. And the other benchmark was GDP. And in 2009 or 2010, depending on how you measure it, China surpassed Japan in terms of overall GDP. So by 2010, clearly, and after the global financial crisis, China had effectively demonstrated economic, technological, and soft power parity with Japan. And it certainly increased its confidence after the global financial crisis, when doubts began to creep in about the viability of the Western model of politics and economic development. So we see a series of events after 2010, and it's just interesting to sort of think of all of these chronologically. In 2010, you saw a Chinese fishing trawler ram into a Japanese patrol vessel. A couple of years later, you saw Chinese activists plant a flag on the Senkakus on a Hong Kong vessel. Protests that year in 2012, after Japan's nationalization of the Senkaku Islands, targeted led to destruction of Japanese cars, restaurants, the closure of Japanese factories in China, and a protest in front of Japanese diplomatic missions. You also saw at this time an increase of Chinese vessels entering into Japanese territorial waters in the contiguous zone around the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. In 2013, a Chinese frigate directed fire control radar at a Japanese destroyer. Japanese fighters were scrambled as Chinese aircraft approached the East China Sea. And also in late 2013, China extended its air defense identification zone into the East China Sea, which has required aircraft to respond. Chinese leaders, far from dampening these sentiments, actually contributed in many ways to anti-Japanese sentiments. Xi Jinping, the president, gave a speech at the Museum of the War of the Chinese People's Resistance Against Japanese Aggression, that's the full name, in Beijing, and warning of the dire consequences of Japan's military rise. In 2015, just last year, we saw a military parade in Beijing on the 70th anniversary of Japan's World War II defeat. It's another matter that China wasn't primarily responsible for Japan's defeat, but so we basically see a sort of growing militarization, a growing nationalist sentiment directed against Japan on China's behalf, and this correlates quite strongly to India-Japan ties, which I'll describe in just a little bit. On the Indian side, India's border dispute doesn't have the same political resonance in China that the dispute with Japan has. But the 1962 war, China-India border war, still casts a pretty long shadow south of the border in India. The causes of the India-China border dispute are many. They include poor demarcation of the boundaries of British India, China's claims over Tibet, and different interpretations of sovereignty. It's a very complex issue, but it's important to note that the frontier remains largely peaceful. In 2013, however, we did see Chinese troops camp in a disputed territory near Depsang. Now, Chinese and Indian overlapping patrols between China and India are actually quite commonplace, but this was markedly different. This was seen as an effort to change the facts on the ground. Similarly, a year later in 2014, when Xi Jinping visited India, a similar incursion took place in another sector on the China-India frontier. These actions may seem minor, but they do shape public opinion. According to a 2013 poll by the Lowy Institute in Australia, over 80% of Indians see China as a threat. There are other Chinese activities beyond the narrow confines of territorial disputes that are causing concern in both Tokyo and New Delhi. One is the issue of freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. Another is China's relations with North Korea and Pakistan, and both are seen as countries that impinge upon, in North Korea's case, Japan, and in Pakistan's case, India's security concerns. China's growing presence in the Indian Ocean littoral is causing a certain amount of concern, including in East Africa, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Myanmar. And Chinese support to Pakistan, particularly nuclear and missile support, is of course raising a lot of red flags in New Delhi. Both India and Japan, therefore, in the context of all of this, have been adapting. In Japan, you've seen Prime Minister Shinzo Abe pass legislation in his first term in 2006, to upgrade what was then Japan's defense agency into a cabinet-level ministry. After returning to power in late 2012, Abe initiated a national security strategy. He created a national security secretariat and unveiled national defense program guidelines. This was followed by new principles for the transfer of defense equipment and technology. He created a new agency in the Ministry of Defense, the new Acquisitions Technology and Logistic Agency, which was to deal with procurement, research and development, and arms exports. And more contentiously, just in the last year, he reinterpreted the Japanese constitution. This required legislation in Japan to enable collective self-defense. Now, all of this, these are all quite incremental changes in Japan, but together they actually constitute a rather profound change to Japan's military capabilities and orientation. You're seeing this play out in real terms. You're seeing the ground self-defense force in Japan becoming smaller, more agile, less focus on the northern regions in Hokkaido and the dispute with Russia, more focused on islands. They're creating a Marine Brigade, a 3,000 strong Marine Brigade. We can expect where that Marine Brigade might be deployed in the future. Meanwhile, India has seen changes at its end, perhaps less concrete, but I would argue no less significant, and more in the diplomatic realm rather than in the security realm. Not all of these changes under Prime Minister Modi mark a complete departure from past policy. Modi does have, however, a certain clarity of India's long-term objectives, and he has a political will to carry it out. And you've seen this translated, for example, into positive developments in relations with the United States, including just last year the joint strategic vision for the Asia-Pacific and Indian Ocean region, which was concluded when President Obama visited India. Modi was also able to conclude a land boundary agreement with Bangladesh, something that the previous government had finalized but didn't have the political capital to see through. Modi has also focused on East Asia, particularly partnerships with democracies. He's visited Mongolia and South Korea, amongst other places. And also you've seen the sort of slow evolution of an Indian Ocean strategy, including visits and defense arrangements with the Seychelles and Mauritius. Now, these are two sort of independent strategies evolving in response in some ways to developments in China, but you see both Japan and India see a certain value in their bilateral partnership. For Japan, India helps secure sea lines of communications by virtue of its geography and maritime capabilities. It helps present Japan as a normal military power. In fact, in the latest Japan-India joint statement, India actually welcomed Japan's passage of legislation on collective self-defense, which is quite remarkable. India can help with maritime domain awareness, and in the words of one of Abe's advisors, India has weight. For India, on the other hand, Japan has better relations with Japan has support across the Indian political spectrum. It's not considered particularly controversial, unlike, say, relations with China, Russia, or the United States. Japan is in fact quite necessary for India if it is to invest in multilateral security cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region. So, for example, you can have a trilateral cooperation between the U.S., Japan, India, Japan, and the United States, or India, Japan, and Australia. But it's hard, for example, to envision meaningful cooperation between India, Australia, and the United States. It's not clear what the added value there is. So Japan is in fact integral to any of these configurations, that security configurations in the Indo-Pacific. Let me briefly describe sort of three stages of the India-Japan partnership and how they've evolved. The relationship, in fact, saw a low point after India conducted nuclear tests in 1998. You saw at that time Japan was India was the largest recipient of Japanese overseas aid. Much of that, not all of it, was jeopardized by that nuclear test, and you saw a distinct souring of the relationship. But you saw quick changes take place quite quickly after that. In 2000, Japanese Prime Minister Mori visited India, and that sort of helped. It was the beginning of sort of normalizing relations after the nuclear tests. But this first phase of engagement, which was described in that initial visit as a global partnership, was in fact quite tentative. You saw a few developments. You saw the beginning of Coast Guard exercises between India and Japan, even at that early stage. There was a meeting of the defense policy groups. So the first kind of formal defense ministry level engagements took place. There were discussions on counter-piracy operations and UN Security Council reform. In 2004, you saw ad hoc cooperation between India, Japan, along with the United States and Australia after the Indian Ocean tsunami. And you also saw at this period initial large-scale investments in strategic investments by Japan in the Delhi-Mumbai industrial corridor. But yet, this first phase was still marked by quite tentative cooperation on the security front. The second phase effectively began in 2006 with the visit of then Defense Minister Pranab Mukherjee to Japan. Later that year, the two described their relationship. They sort of upgraded it from a global partnership to a strategic and global partnership. And when Prime Minister Abe visited India in 2007, he gave a quite remarkable speech in the Indian Parliament where he talked about a confluence of two seas. He drew upon the name, the language used by a Mughal prince, Dara Shikoh, but in this case he was referring to the confluence of the Indian and Pacific Oceans, and which gets to the point that was raised about the term Indo-Pacific. In some ways it was an early articulation of thinking about the Indian and Pacific Oceans as a single strategic context. We now, in fact, take that for granted, but at the time it was quite an ambitious sort of vision that he articulated. In 2007, you saw India, Japan, Australia, and the United States, and along with Singapore, in fact, take part in multilateral maritime exercises, something that caused a certain amount of consternation in Beijing. However, after doing this, all of them backed off for various reasons. In 2008, you saw India and Japan announce a joint declaration on security cooperation. You saw the initiation of maritime staff talks between the Maritime Self-Defense Force and the Indian Navy. In 2009, you saw an intention for annual bilateral naval exercises, although it took 3 years in 2012 was when the first bilateral exercises took place. In 2013, Japan approached India with the proposal to sell aircraft, which was again quite ambitious at the time, given Japan's own self-imposed restrictions on selling defense equipment. This period also saw, between 2006 and 2014, staff college exchanges, port calls, and various other examples of visible maritime diplomacy. You saw the initiation of what's called a 2+2 dialogue involving the foreign and defense ministries of both countries. This is the only country with which India has such a dialogue is Japan. You saw the creation and the evolution of the G4, the coming together of India, Japan, Germany, and Brazil for UN Security Council reform. But this period of between 2006 and 2014 was also marked by doubts. In Japan, various prime ministers belonging to the Democratic Party of Japan made certain efforts, and actually including the LDP, in fact, made various efforts to normalize relations with China, efforts that didn't really go very far. Meanwhile, in India, Defense Minister A.K. Anthony reportedly vetoed multilateral exercises in the Indian Ocean, and also declined Japanese offers of cooperation on anti-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden. So there's a certain amount of hesitation in both Japan and India about deepening cooperation, mostly because both are worried about upsetting Beijing. Which brings us to the third phase of cooperation, which really began after Prime Minister Modi was elected. Again, the rhetoric went up as well. It became from a strategic and global partnership, it became a special strategic and global partnership. And this saw, for example, India welcome Japan's legislation on collective self-defense. You saw them making, in their joint statement, agreeing on freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, again, diplomatically quite significant. You saw the Malabar exercises, which were a bilateral US-India exercise, upgraded effectively to a trilateral exercise with Japan invited as a permanent member or a permanent guest to the exercises. Japan sent 2 more defense attaches to India. India became only the 5th country to which Japan has 4 defense attaches from all 3 services in the Coast Guard. You saw an agreement over the transfer of defense technology just recently, and an agreement on the protection of sharing of classified military information. And you also saw expanded staff talks expand to all 3 services. So again, you're seeing gradual progress. The one thing is you see slightly less hesitation on the part of both parties of being concerned about how China views these developments. Let me briefly just focus on some of the limitations to the partnership, despite this incremental progress. You're seeing several people, including Dr. Rajamohan, who's affiliated with this institute, he's come out with a book chapter. It should be out quite soon on India-Japan security cooperation, and he cites a number of reasons, all of them very relevant for sort of caution in India-Japan relations. He cites, for example, bureaucratic resistance, doubts about how the U.S. views these developments, the sort of hangover of the Cold War. He sees the nuclear issue as possibly getting in the way, the fact that India has nuclear weapons and there being a certain amount of resistance to that in Japan. Parochialism on both sides, concerns about Chinese sensitivities. Others have cited difficulties in private sector cooperation between the two, and there's certainly many examples of that. However, I would contend that many of these have, despite presenting real obstacles, have been overcome. In particular, actually, the U.S. attitude towards the India-Japan relationship has changed quite drastically. You're seeing them being much more, Washington being much more welcoming of that relationship. In the words of one Japanese official I spoke to, Washington's doubts are always temporary. There are other limitations, I think, which are structural, and both sides will just have to get over. One of them is Japan's presence within the U.S. alliance structure, and India certainly will not join the U.S. alliance structure, and will have to deal with certain difficulties that come with that, including, for example, Japanese communication systems. You also have different attitudes towards freedom of navigation. India, in fact, has India's policy towards military presence inside its exclusive economic zone is not something that Japan necessarily agrees with, and has proven a little bit difficult. But I suspect that's something that both sides will just have to get around. However, I think there are 4 differences that are important because they're at risk of being overlooked. One is that there's a danger of making defense sales central to the security partnership. Now, this may seem like a natural development, which is India and Japan are doing all of these things together in the security realm. It seems natural that Japan would that there'd be military assistance and defense sales, but there are also concerns here. Specifically, Japan has offered a US-2 aircraft to India, which is a sort of amphibious aircraft. Mostly, they can be used for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, but there are concerns in India about the cost and the export potential of the platform. And in fact, the experience that Japan has had trying to sell submarines to Australia is in fact quite instructive, because it really could be a setback if India does not, or if India agrees to it, and their technical and cost-related complications. Japanese defense companies are also quite inexperienced in dealing with foreign buyers, and the Indian defense marketplace is quite crowded. Some have posited other proposals in addition to US-2, so for example, selling submarine rescue vehicles or minesweepers, but whatever the platform, I would say the same applies. So I think both sides should be quite cautious about making defense sales central to the relationship. Secondly, I think both need to be a lot more concerned about, take into account the other's regional security concerns. India doesn't always put North Korea as a top priority. I think India has been quite critical of North Korea's nuclear tests, but it's obviously not a primary security concern for India. Similarly, Japan has not always paid due attention to India's sensitivities with respect to Pakistan. So I think that's part of the learning process. Both sides need to be a little bit more sensitive to the other's regional security concerns. 3, both need to ensure that any gains made in the security relationship outlive their current prime ministers. This is, I would say, a minor concern. It's not a major one. While Abe has managed to institutionalize a lot of the changes in the Japanese side through legislation, through executive actions and administrative reform, Modi's changes are largely based on his personality. And we can see a future Indian Prime Minister, even one from his same party, have a rather different orientation towards Japan and towards the regional security context. Finally, I think we should moderate our expectations and expect only steady progress, slow but steady progress. Japan has to pull along public opinion. There still is a lot of public resistance to militarization and foreign military deployments. It would be interesting to see if Japan currently has a UN peacekeeping force in South Sudan. If, for example, Japan were to take casualties on that or another mission, it would be interesting to see if public sentiment turns quite strongly against some of Abe's national security reforms. India, meanwhile, has some serious resource constraints at its end, and I don't just mean financial constraints. It actually has a lot of constraints on its ability to project force, particularly in the maritime domain. Its submarine fleet is in fact shrinking. It's not been able to acquire new vessels fast enough, and its entire acquisition and production defense production system is in fact quite flawed and in serious trouble. So I think we can expect we should expect deeper cooperation, but I think we do need to be a bit more cautious and modest about what to expect. Finally, let me just outline 2 broad areas of future cooperation which both sides should think about if they are to upgrade the relationship. One is that despite Abe's national security reforms, official development assistance, ODA, is in fact Japan's biggest weapon and remains so. Meanwhile, India hasn't fully exploited its geographical advantages. So one of the things both sides should consider is strategically using ODA, Japanese ODA, and India's geographical advantages for basically to prevent the Indian Ocean and specifically the Bay of Bengal from becoming the next locus of strategic competition in the Indo-Pacific. Basically preventing the Bay of Bengal from becoming the next South China Sea. Now, some of this is already taking place, although at a very slow level or at a conceptual level. For example, in Northeast India, a strategically important region, Japan is already investing in and helping to develop some of the road infrastructure there, specifically National Highway 51 in Meghalaya and 54 in Mizoram, right by the border with Myanmar. But the same kind of ODA, strategic uses of ODA can be applied elsewhere. One is in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which again is a strategically significant location that India hasn't fully used to its advantage. And additionally, they can also partner in third countries, in Bangladesh, in Myanmar, in Sri Lanka, in East Africa, and even Iran. Both countries, in fact, enjoy quite strong relations with, or positive relations with Iran, and this would be a way of potentially linking Central Asia to Iran, possibly via Afghanistan, Western Afghanistan. Both Modi and Abe in 2015 visited all 5 Central Asian republics, and so I think there's been a big emphasis there, and a lot of this is in response to China's own One Belt, One Road. So one leg of which runs from China to Pakistan to the port of Gwadar. So potentially cooperating and linking Central Asia to Iran through the port of Chabahar, in which India is already invested in, might be one area for the two countries to consider deeper cooperation. The second broad area is actually expanding cooperation laterally. I mean, it's been very maritime focused to date, but actually expanding ground and air cooperation through trilateral exercises. And here the U.S. role is in fact necessary. Marine forces, maritime exercises don't require, unlike maritime exercises, air exercises require designated airspace, which is often a problem. Ground forces require status of forces agreements and lead to other legal complications. But both can actually do a lot more cooperation trilaterally with the United States. The red flag exercises, for example, present one opportunity. Both Japan and India will be participating this year. Present one opportunity for trilateral air exercise between the air forces. And particularly given India's shortages in terms of its maritime expeditionary capability and Japan's development of a marine force, the cooperation with the U.S. Marines would actually be quite useful in improving both countries' capabilities. So let me end on that note. I mean, just provide a brief overview. I mean, we're seeing how various actions by China, both in terms of territorial disputes and in the region, are increasing security concerns in both India and Japan. We see both sides adapting to it and each finding in the other certain advantages, and those cooperations we're seeing cooperation gradually develop and accelerate under Abe and Modi. There's certain reasons to, I think, moderate expectations, which I did outline, but I think that these two areas, improving cooperation between the trilateral cooperation between the ground and air forces, and using Japan's ODA for cooperation for strategically in India, in places like the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, and also in third countries, would be a way of qualitatively upgrading the relationship. So let me end on that note, and hopefully we can have a discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Jaishankar. Covered a lot of ground there, and fortunately we got about an hour for Q&A. I open the floor to questions. I try to take questions in batches of 3. So that work for you? Yeah. And then try to keep your comments brief, questions brief, and then so we can do as many questions as possible. Can I have the first round of questions? Professor Mitra.
Thank you very much for taking us to unfamiliar territory. I've got 2 questions for you. In general, I like the speaker to tell me what he finds interesting in the topic. I mean, you could have chosen a number of topics. Why did you choose this one? What are there policy reasons why you chose it? Or is this pointing towards new ground in terms of the theory of international relations? I mean, you have done interviews and you're toying with the construction of this relationship along with its realistic underpinning. So I'd like to know a little more about that. The second point is something you touched on towards the end of your talk. You see, what looks like a bilateral relationship is sometimes the visible parts of a triangular relationship. So is there a third one, a significant other? Is it China? Is it the United States? And if it is a triangular relationship, then what kind of overtures might India or Japan be making towards the third in terms of drawing on this third partner to get traction with one another? Thank you.
Maybe Surya first, then Dr. Chaudhary.
Yeah.
Sorry. Never mind, Dr. Chaudhary first. He did raise his hand before you, actually, to be fair. Yeah.
If I raise my hand before him, then it's automatic.
Yeah, it is. Sorry for the confusion.
No, Dhruva, it's good to have you. I've interacted with you in Shangri-La, Ditchley, Vancouver, and it's good to hear you again. And your contribution was in line with the quality of contributions you made on those other occasions as well. I have a specific question for you, which is something that you didn't touch upon, but it has to do with a common aspiration of both India and Japan in the international fora. This is the Security Council membership of the Security Council. Now, given the fact that the bilateral relationship is burgeoning, it is likely to deepen Chinese resistance to the aspirations of both. Now, is there a genuine fear that something like this could happen? So a deepening of this relationship is not necessarily good for individual aspirations, particularly multilateral aspirations of both India and Japan. Thank you.
Surya?
Yeah, it was fascinating to hear your thoughts about strategizing ODA for purposes of security. In the Northeast, probably you can camouflage economic projects, but how can you do that in Andaman and Nicobar, which is essentially, everyone knows that it is of strategic importance for India. Not that Northeast India is not strategically important, but then there are populations, and so economic projects can be a cover for strategic purposes. And secondly, civil nuclear deal, of course, is not exactly a security issue, but it does impinge on overall bilateral relationship. Do you think it will really happen? And if so, what makes you think so? Or do you think it will fall through? Thank you.
Maybe you can take these three questions first.
Yeah. Well, this is it's quite a lot to take. Let me take them in reverse order, if that's okay. On Mr. Suryanarayan's question on ODA, so Japan's ODA is officially pacific. It can't provide. The closest it gets with flirting with military is actually providing patrol vessels to Vietnam, and which is law enforcement on the sea. So it's technically not military, but so ODA will have to be pacifist in nature. Now, there are other requirements in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, right? Which is India needs port infrastructure somewhere. Actually, a big reason why India isn't perhaps the trade player that it should be in the global economy is because it just doesn't have the port. Other reasons as well, but it's quite limited by its port infrastructure. As somebody put it, India's two biggest ports are Dubai and Singapore. So they certainly need to develop a deep sea port, particularly. And the Andaman and Nicobar Islands also have the advantage. Given the difficulty of acquiring land in mainland India, certainly some of the uninhabited islands of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands allow for a certain amount of development there without the challenges necessarily of land acquisition. Independent of the security dimension, there is a potential to use the Andaman and Nicobar Islands to develop India's port civilian port capabilities and for commercial purposes. Those same port facilities might have a dual use implications, so would be helpful. And in fact, that's largely, officially, again, a lot of China's port development in the Indian Ocean is nominally civilian. If it can help with supplying its navy, that's an added benefit. So I mean, I think the same logic would apply there. But I think independent of the strategic dimension, I mean, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands could be a potential place to develop using Japanese ODA. On the civil nuclear cooperation, I was in fact when Abe visited India, they agreed to do it in principle. They called on both sides to have, I mean, the technical negotiations were to follow. When I was in Tokyo, I didn't get the details, but from people involved in it at the foreign ministry, they were actually quite bullish and said it was very close to being completed. So I was, in fact, when I went to Tokyo, I was a little bit more skeptical, like yourself, but the people I spoke to in the Japanese foreign ministry seemed to think that it was not quite a done deal, but very close. So I would say it's a bit more optimistic. There is a certain amount of resistance, particularly from the Japanese foreign minister, Kishida. He happens to be from Hiroshima, which I think is a certain factor. But he's also ideologically somewhat resistant. But I think now that you've had a political commitment at the highest level, I think it's only a matter of time before that is seen through. To your comments, it's a tricky question. I mean, China has never been enthusiastic about Japan's presence on the UN Security Council, and so as a permanent member. So I'm not sure if we've seen an increase in resistance. I mean, there's always been a certain amount of resistance. I'm not sure if that resistance would noticeably increase because of Japan's relations with India, possibly because of Japan's various national security reforms, as I described, that Prime Minister Abe has undertaken. But I think, I mean, I'm personally just skeptical of there being large-scale UN Security Council reform for a number of reasons. I don't think any of the current permanent members will want to cede space or share space, and certainly I think some of the European countries, Britain and France, will not want to give up any space if it comes down to that. So I'm personally quite skeptical. It is interesting, though, that at the sidelines of the last UN General Assembly meeting, the G4, the heads of government did meet. It was the first time in 9 years, I think, that all four heads of the prime ministers or presidents of Brazil, Germany, Japan, and India had all met in one place. But I think at best they can hope for is lining up, ensuring that there's enough support from other members of the UN General Assembly that they can force this through. But it does seem to be part of a long-term process. So I don't follow the machinations of the United Nations as closely as many do, and I suspect as you do. But I'm personally a little bit skeptical that we'll see any change. But I don't see this as. I suspect China will be resistant to Japan's joining, regardless of any of these recent developments with India. Dr. Mitra, I think you've asked a set of very complex questions, and I'm not sure anybody could answer them well, and I'm not sure I could. Let's see. From a theoretical point of view, one of the things that the developments that seems to be taking place in both Tokyo and New Delhi is a return to realism. We're seeing both think of their partnership with each other and relations with China in very strong balance of power terms, and talking about it more openly in balance of power terms. Now, this doesn't mean that certain other liberal ideals have been completely thrown by the way. I mean, I think both are very much invested in the institutional architecture. You see both Abe and Modi talk a lot more about democratic cooperation, so values, cooperation values. In fact, in Tony Abbott, they found another likely a happy partner in this effort for a while. But I mean, the primary motivation does seem to be very realist in its nature. And so if you're thinking about what the theory of the theoretical implications of all of this are, I would say it's in fact the return to a very realist realpolitik world. In terms of why I was interested in this, quite honestly, it was for personal reasons. Partly, I'm from India, but I grew up in Japan, and I never had an opportunity to study the relationship between the two at length. So this opportunity in Singapore actually afforded me the possibility of developing a sort of deeper appreciation for developments in the region. So it was partly that. Two, I think it was genuinely motivated by the fact that both countries, I mean, this was in some ways the most important relationship that the fewest people were talking about and understood. Part of it is for language reasons. I mean, you don't have a lot of Japan experts in India. There are a few, there are a handful. You don't have a lot of traditional India experts in Japan. And the other thing is, I think it's been moving so fast that it's been hard for people to keep up with developments. The two prime ministers now do meet annually. And the progress has been, as I described, sort of incremental, but over time quite meaningful in a relatively short amount of time. So I think for all of these reasons, I think it was worthy of discussion, regardless of my own personal interest. And finally, on your question about a triangle, I mean, I'd say there are three other triangles that this is part of. There is obviously there's a India, China, Japan triangle, in which case both China has active territorial disputes with both India and Japan. It has security competition with India and Japan, and that is causing the two other ends of that triangle to come closer together. There is a US-Japan-India triangle, which is the US has been deep. I mean, obviously has the most important alliance it has in Asia is with Japan, and the most in some ways its fastest improving partnership in Asia is with India. So we've seen effectively more of a convergence. Ironically, though, there was a period, I think, where both Tokyo and New Delhi were concerned about American disengagement from Asia, which was actually for a while a driving force for why Japan and India came closer together. They were both concerned that the U.S. commitment to stability and security in the Asia-Pacific was wavering a little bit. I think some of those concerns have been put to rest just in the last year or two. I think the Prime Minister Abe's visit to Washington was quite, and the revision of the guidelines with the U.S. was one factor. I think President Obama's visit to India and the agreement on they didn't use Indo-Pacific, the Indian Ocean, the Asia-Pacific and Indian Ocean regions. That joint statement was quite important for India to sort of as an indicator of American strategic intentions. While on the one hand it was U.S. disengagement that was bringing the two together, you now have active U.S. interest in facilitation and bringing the two together, which has been helpful. There's a third emerging triangle, which is India, Japan, Australia. And the three have just started last year. They had their first foreign secretary, vice minister level talks, just the three of them, without the United States. But that's still in its very early stages, and it'll have to be seen. The level of enthusiasm and capacity in all three capitals will have to be gauged. But I mean, we have seen something Malcolm and others can speak to. But actually, we've seen a deepening of the Japan-Australia security relationship as well, and that came up a lot in my conversations in Tokyo.
Next set, Malcolm.
Yeah, I wanted to be a bit rude and have two short comments, because you may have already covered this, coming from my work on Australia, Japan, and then one Southeast Asia focused question. On the two comments, I think India, they're both about bipartisanship in Japan. So one, India plays a kind of unique role. So both Hatoyama and Abe saw stronger Japan-India relations as key to their quite divergent views of Japan's role in East Asia. Hatoyama, East Asia community, keeping the United States out, and Abe not. And that kind of goes back more to historic ties between India and Japan. In the case of Abe, the role his family has played in India-Japan relations. So India plays a kind of unique role in Japan's worldview. I think, and again, I'm sure you might have covered this, I think there's a mistaken view that a lot of Japan's recent changes are primarily due to Abe or the right wing of Japan, which is totally false, actually, because many of the reforms that Abe has accelerated took place under the DPJ, from including the 2010 National Defense Policy Guidelines, which were the first to really shift the focus from fighting a war against the Soviet Union to fighting one in the East China Sea versus China. You had Foreign Minister Okada, who's now the leader of the opposition, talking about Japan must deter China in East Asia. So, and I think even the movement from the Japan Defense Agency to the level of Ministry of Defense took place as well. So I think Japan's shift, Abe certainly has benefited from it and accelerated, but it's very deep and structural. I'm not sure if India's is as bipartisan and as deep. The question I had, and kind of having done this within Singapore, I think Southeast Asian states are often worried about if any major powers get together and get closer, what does that mean for the small states of Southeast Asia, particularly if they throw in comments on the South China Sea. So I was wondering, in your 6 weeks in Singapore, when you were touching on this topic, whether you came across any of those sensitivities. Thanks.
Maybe I'll take the prerogative of the chair to ask, I guess, questions/comments. The first is this: people use this phrase all the time, and I think some people don't even understand how they use it. I'm not saying you, but I'm just wanted to push you a bit. Freedom of navigation. It's like saying we want world peace. I mean, it means everything but means nothing at the same time. From what I understand freedom of navigation, there are two kinds of freedom of navigation. One is freedom of commercial shipping, right? If you look at this region, if you look at you look at China, India, USA, and say Japan, all have an interest in making sure that commercial shipping carries on, right? I think broadly we can agree, right? That in a sense, you call it a norm, you want to call it self-interest, all agree. Now the disagreement is on the second type of freedom of navigation, which is when navies move around, right? And I think in this case, and this is a hypothesis that's been put forward by somebody I won't mention, but that after a while, as the Chinese military grows, their concept of freedom of navigation, military freedom of navigation, will be similar. When they get the capability to go around Alaska and down, they and the Americans will agree on the notions of freedom of navigation. So in the moment, some people argue, the differences are because the Chinese military capability hasn't grown to a level where it can exercise that kind of freedom of navigation. That's just something I just think on top of the head. Number two is, again, trying to be controversial, that actually the main story isn't India-Japan. The main story is US-China. And the main story is US-China mainly because, it's not original obviously what I'm saying, but the main story obviously, the main reason why the main story is US-China is because, if you want, it depends whether you want to theoretically frame this as kind of, transition, great power transition, etc., shift of power, balance power shift, that basically things like the South China Sea are just a proxy for adjusting of power, right? That Chinese power is growing and the South China Sea is not going to break out into an all-out war. It's just testing each other and seeing, you got to give a bit more, I'm going to take a bit more, right? And so the main story, the other stories are not as important. I'm just saying there's this hypothesis. The rest is all cloud cover. The main story is how the US-China relationship will finally stabilize to say, okay, I think I'm happy with you having this much, you're happy with me having that much. Sorry. Just sorry to throw that out at you.
Okay. To Malcolm's point about bipartisanship, I mean, I think I think you're right that there is a certain amount growing bipolarity in Japan on some of these issues. you see this also filter down to the bureaucratic level and in the permanent bureaucracy. And it's actually interesting in my interactions in both at conferences and meet in private meetings with Japanese bureaucrats who will be there regardless of the political relationship, how in some ways critical they've and openly critical they've become of China. So I think that's another reason to think that sort of some of this will change, will stay regardless. In India, Japan has a very sort of curious place for a few reasons. One is the historical figure of Subhash Chandra Bose, who is now in the news actually just in the last few days in India for a variety of reasons. But he's somebody who both the right wing has rallied around and sort of propped up as a sort of a figure, and because he is Bengali and the Indian Communist parties are traditionally their base was one of their bases is West Bengal. The left has also sort of used him as a supportive figure, and so his relationship with Japan is in fact quite important in sort of creating a sort of sense of bipartisan consensus about sort of India should deepen relations with Japan for those reasons. In fact, I would say sort of that there are possibly three figures who have whose legacy is very positive for the India-Japan relationship. One is him. One is Nehru, who actually developed that relationship with Prime Minister Kishida, Abe's grandfather, that Abe now sort of thinks of very sentimentally. And the third figure is actually Radha Manohar Pal, the Indian justice who at the Tokyo trials, who has become a sort of a bit of a cult figure in Japan. So in fact, all of their legacies, in fact, reflect quite positively on the India-Japan relationship today. But it has helped create a certain sort of bipartisan consensus that India-Japan relationship is good. Although you did see one of the Communist parties of India criticize recently some of Modi's outreach efforts with Abe saying it would antagonize China. But I don't think it's motivated by anti-Japanese sentiments per se. On Southeast Asia, on how Southeast Asia views, that's really interesting. I haven't really seen anything. I think partly because the India-Japan relationship is secondary, which actually gets to your question. It's not really gotten the attention here necessarily that it may deserve. And the other thing is, it's quite unclear for very different reasons what India and Japan can both make joint statements about the South China Sea. There should be freedom of navigation. There's very little they can actually do about it for very different in India's reasons purely for it may not have the capabilities to regularly at least do freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. It could possibly do a few. Japan, of course, may not want to get. That creates a whole different set of issues. So maybe for those reasons, it's also not created the same kind of concern that of two larger powers getting together that it could otherwise. It actually leads to your question about. I mean, I wouldn't dispute the fact that the U.S.-China dynamic is in fact the big story in the Asia-Pacific. I mean, at every forum, that is the big discussion. I do think though India and Japan are perhaps in the second tier of powers, and both have a blue water capability that a lot of the ASEAN countries don't have necessarily. Both have a certain amount of resources. In India's case, it's sort of second largest army. One of the largest armed forces, sort of battle experienced military. In Japan's case, it's obviously a lot of its economic resources, and technological resources. So I mean, in many ways they're quite complementary. But I would say that one of the reasons why this is important is perhaps it's flying a little bit under the radar. Everyone's talking about the U.S.-China dynamic, and I think this is the other relationship that. And by the way, I do believe. I mean, it would be interesting. I haven't gone to Beijing recently, but it would be nice. I mean, I have talked to a certain number of Chinese scholars about some of this, but to get how China views. There is a problem with this, which is the Chinese who pay attention to Japan are not the Chinese who pay attention to India, and vice versa. So there are very few people who've actually sort of been able to tie the dots. It is interesting, though, that very shortly after Modi became Prime Minister, and it was expected that Japan would be one of his first destinations for a bilateral visit. It was actually his third after Nepal and Bhutan. But Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi came to Delhi, and my understanding is that was driven primarily by concerns about the India-Japan relationship. So, I mean, I do think that certain people in Beijing are looking at this evolving relationship quite carefully. To get to your question of freedom of navigation, you know, I mean, you're right that it's used quite a lot. I do think there are certain concerns. I mean, I wouldn't dismiss the commercial aspect so easily. The reason being, you know, in principle, while everybody has an interest in in commercial navigation, I think what everyone is concerned about is the possibility of a certain actor in certain contingencies blocking certain commercial shipping that would have, you know, and having the ability and to do that, to create leverage. In that sense, I think the Chinese export ban on rare earths to Japan was maybe a warning sign on that note. So I think there are some concerns about commercial shipping, not overall, but sort of the possibility of certain commercial shipping being blocked. Military. I mean, it'd be interesting. I mean, that would be a question actually for China, for somebody who studies the PLA. I'm not really sure of China's views on change. But you know, I mean, this interpretation of if the South China Sea were to become a Chinese lake, as some maybe more alarmist predictions predict, what might be the implications of that? And I think there it perhaps is the fear of the unknown. I mean, at work. But I do think I mean, I would completely agree with you that the big story in the region is the US-China dynamic. The South China Sea is a way of testing. I mean, as actually, it was a Japanese official who told me this, but he said basically this is going to be the big test of bipolarity in the region. If China gets its way in the South China Sea, you will have a bipolar Asia.
Any other questions? Yes.
Dhruva, Dhruva, thanks very much. This is all very interesting, especially not a dyad that I focus on very often, but that I often come across in Myanmar. And I know you spoke about this a little bit in terms of Japanese financing of road developments in northeastern India. But of course, there's also lots of Japanese financing in Myanmar, and also Indian efforts to develop northeastern access via Myanmar through the Caledon project. And it seems to be one place in particular where all three countries, China, Japan, and India, really are competing for influence in a very aggressive way. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that and whether there's scope for more cooperation between India and Japan in Myanmar, because we haven't really seen a lot of that yet, or if that would perhaps be a bridge too far or excite Chinese anxieties in a way that would be unhelpful.
So you mean like the way that he suggested, kind of strategic use of Japanese ODA? Is that?
Yeah, it could be Japanese ODA in terms of their special economic zones, which are not actually engineered to help India now, but could be, because they're very involved in Tilawa right outside Yangon, but also Dawei, which is actually, I think, serves Chinese interests in a way, because it's the road between Dawei to Bangkok would potentially shorten Chinese transit times and avoid the Straits of Malacca. But it seems like I'm not aware of any discussions about cooperation there. I'm wondering if you think it's advisable or if you've heard some things.
So I would say it's advisable, but I would say competition in Myanmar is interesting because I don't think it's zero-sum. Partly because the base is so much lower for development. I mean, there's room for everybody to invest and everyone to have their projects and to benefit. So I'm not sure whether it would necessarily lead to more zero-sum competition between India, China, and Japan. There doesn't seem to be a lot of India-Japan coordination yet in Myanmar, to my knowledge. I didn't come across a lot of this. But there certainly is room to do a little bit more. You're also seeing India and China possibly cooperate in Myanmar in a way. I mean, for example, I mean, there's always talk about this Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar corridor. You might be able to speak a little bit more to that, but it's not been making the progress that it possibly should. But I don't think there's any sort of intrinsic. Well, India has been very skeptical of many parts of One Belt, One Road, particularly the maritime and the China-Pakistan economic corridor. This is a sort of spar of the One Belt, One Road that would actually involve India-China cooperation if it were to materialize. There's another just problem, which is India doesn't really do infrastructure very well. It's not its forte at home or abroad, and even when it has done it in Iran, Afghanistan, it's often been very much over behind The timetables have run longer than they should have, the cost overruns and the like. So that's just not a particularly good sort of India just doesn't compete in that area. When it does, it's the private sector. It's not really state-run investment. It's just not, I mean, much like the United States, it's just not China and Japan do that very well. India just doesn't compete at the same level. So I'm not sure what India can bring to the table, and I think India would very much welcome. I would say, so this is a long way of answering the question, but I would say in Myanmar, it would be a place where they need not cooperate, but they can coordinate. So it would be, the Indians and Japanese talking about various projects that they're working on in Myanmar and seeing where it would benefit each other's interests, rather than them cooperating together on a joint project. I really don't see what the added value is for either side in doing that. But I think we can see a lot more coordination. Yeah.
Jian?
Just a quick question. Are we seeing a more expanded mandate for the Indian Navy where it has a diplomatic role to play in the region? And, if it's part of a larger trend where the Indian Navy is gaining in prominence within the armed forces, sort of a balance of power relation between the three?
Yeah. That's a good question. I think, okay, let me put the two ways of looking at it. One is, I think the diplomatic potential of diplomatic potential and importance of the Navy has now been appreciated in India. So you see a lot more port visits, exercises. There's going to be in just a few weeks' time. There's going to be a big international fleet review off Visakhapatnam, which actually both China and Japan and many other countries will be participating in. So I mean, there's a clear diplomatic value, and I think that's understood and appreciated in India. We're also seeing, I mean, this sort of slightly different aspect of it, but in Singapore they have a naval attaché permanently stationed here as the defense attaché. In Japan, until now it's been a tri-service thing, so that it rotates between the Army, Air Force, and Navy. But it's after the current person is an Army, but after this it'll be a permanently naval position. So I mean, this is kind of indicative of where India sees a role for sort of permanently stationing the Navy. In terms of its relative importance in India, I think you have a mismatch here between aspirations and the reality, right? So the rhetoric is very much focused now, like every speech that the defense minister or the prime minister gives on defense issues tends to have a very big maritime component to it. And it, sort of talks much more ambitiously about India playing providing in the global commons and in the Indian Ocean. You have seen an increase in the defense budget over time, but it's been a pretty marginal increase. It's not been dramatic, and it's certainly not been in line with the stated ambitions of. I think you will see some inter-service rivalry here, and the Army being so dominant will always have a big piece. A colleague of mine at RSIS, Anand Mukherjee, he had a very good op-ed in the Indian Express just a couple of days ago where he talked about this, and he said India is the only country which is talking about defense, upgrading its defense technology while expanding the size of its military. And in fact, India should probably think about shrinking the size of its military if it wants to qualitatively upgrade its defense forces. But I think this would apply in particular to the Navy. I would say the big question mark in India is the Air Force, which I think has not quite understood what its role is. It's right now been relegated to almost a ground support role, which it resents because it sort of sets it below the Army, and because the Navy is expanding its naval aviation. India should at some point have 3 aircraft carriers. Then it sort of calls into question what the role of the Air Force is. So I think the Air Force is going to face a big identity crisis in the near future.
Any other questions? Okay, I just will end with thanking you very much, Mr. Jaishankar. It was an excellent presentation, and I thought the questions are being so. Maybe can we thank our guests in the customary way?
Thank you.
Now I come to a slightly awkward part of the evening. Normally what we do is we present the speaker with a book by one of the authors in the institute. I had no role in selecting my own book to pass to you. And beyond my control, but slightly awkward. Really, I had nothing to say. So anyway, thank you. And there's tea and coffee outside. Yeah, so thanks. So just leaves me the task of passing you the book.